Hello, and welcome to the latest episode in IR Magazine's socially distanced video series, Wednesday Winners, where I speak to IR Magazine award winners around the world in a socially distanced manner. This week, I'm joined by Seth Frank, Vice President of Treasury and Investor Relations at Hanger. Hanger won the Best Investor Engagement Award at our Small Cap Awards in America last year. So, Seth, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ben. It's good to speak with you over Zoom.
Absolutely, yeah. So, Seth, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, your story with Hanger and the company story. I know that the company sort of delisted a few years ago, and then you joined, and there's a sort of a process of trying to kind of reestablish credibility with the investment community. So perhaps you could give us a little bit of background about Hanger first, and then we'll get into some specifics about what you did when you joined.
Sure. Thanks for the question and the interest in the company and our IR program. So Hanger is really a company like no other. It has a history that goes back over 160 years in the United States. We're 100% domestic revenue, and we are the largest provider, healthcare provider of prosthetic and orthotic services in the United States. So that's artificial limbs, as well as bracing and other musculoskeletal devices to help basically either replace a missing limb or help compensate for, repair, or rehabilitate an injured limb, basically, and that's what orthotics are. The market we participate in is approximately $4.3 billion in the United States. So it's not huge, but the good news for us and the story of the company is we're by far the largest provider of these services in the United States. It's a very mission-driven company, as you can imagine. I'd encourage any of you, quick marketing pitch here. If nothing else, just follow us on social media. You can see some really inspiring stories about what our clinicians do every day in terms of helping people to be mobile and to rehabilitate after sometimes just, will otherwise be, life, practically, for all practical purposes, life-ending type of injuries or disease processes. So it really is a pleasure to be in the IR chair at a company that you can really kind of get behind what we do. That said, I've only been at the company a couple of years, joined in January of 2018. The company went public, I think, in the mid-'80s or something along those lines. And like a lot of companies that are public, and because the orthotics and prosthetics industry, otherwise known as O&P, is very fragmented, a lot of small providers, most of its growth came through inorganic acquisition of smaller providers all over the country for years. And at some point in the early 2000s, the company really outgrew its ability to have the proper financial controls, for lack of a better term, around kind of this sprawling empire of O&P clinics it had acquired. It really hadn't integrated them well. But the biggest issue was there were some serious deficiencies at the corporate level around the ability to have proper financial controls in place is the direct answer. And, after turnover of the board and promotion of the CEO, sort of during the turmoil, he and one or two board members set about recreating the governance of the company, as well as building an integration and growth plan for the company. But the hole that was dug in terms of the financials was tremendous. Basically, the company in 2014, June of 2014, second quarter, was the last time it had reported a on-time quarter until just before we relisted in 2018. So if you just think about that, and what that means is the company was in arrears in a very real way. So basically what happened was the company stopped reporting, was kind of chronically late in its filings. That led to it needed to do a restatement. It was a mess. And basically, due to NYSE rules, the company found itself, unfortunately, in a delisted situation in February of 2016, primarily as a failure to keep current in its SEC filings. And so the company migrated to the pink sheets, to the over-the-counter market, and stayed there for a long time. I was approached about the opportunity in late 2017, as the company was really kind of had been very quiet publicly for several years, but was, if you use kind of an aviation analogy, was kind of turning from base to final approach in terms of a path to go public again. It was technically public, but for all intents and purposes for the shareholders, they were locked in and locked up because of the OTC market. So the company doubled down on all the strategies I went through, and was basically looking to join the ranks of normalized public companies again, and reached out to me, amongst others, to find someone to lead an IR effort as that time approached.
Sure. And so, from your perspective, you joined, I think you said in January 2018. And so, in your seat, you're responsible for both treasury and IR. And so how did you go about, trying to reestablish that credibility? Clearly, it sounds like some work was already being done, and the company was beginning to ramp up and think about relisting. But, what did you prioritize? It must be a pretty kind of overwhelming prospect to come into a company like that and go, okay, well, where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it really wasn't a public company even when I joined, because there was no filing activity. There was no investor deck. Legally, we couldn't really meet with anybody. The only thing that was going on was the company quarterly was filing an 8K document with a consolidated cash flow. So, and this is remarkable, actually. There was one analyst who kept writing on the company even while it was delisted, which even now strikes me. I don't think anyone would do that now, but in 2016, 17, there was an analyst or two willing to do that. But for all intents and purposes, it was a zombie type of stock, because you couldn't really trade it. There was no public information, but yet the equity existed. It was just unclear whether it was going to be a going concern or whatever. But so no one knew what the revenues were. No one knew anything, particularly in the kind of the dark period between, the middle of 2014 and the company putting out its restatement in, I think it was May of 16. So it was, a couple of years with no fund. So, and the reason I kind of go through all that is it was sort of like an IPO in some ways, but with baggage. Sort of like if a company went private through PE and tried to come back out, but this, had baggage. It had shareholders and other things. So, it really had to go through the total litany of tactical and strategic aspects of IR, assessing the shareholder base. There was only so much you could do in terms of communications. But the main thing was to get to know the business and get to know the people inside, develop a very strong, close relationship with the management team. And I was on site and able to do that and really learn the industry and get up to speed. But we had to do everything. We had to pick which exchange we were going to go back on, design a deck from scratch. I had to build an entire IR plan about what kind of analysts would we target. But this was also being done while the company was in sort of this race to get current, because you couldn't relist without being current, and current meant catching up. So the week I got there, the company was in the process of preparing to file a jumbo 10K for the years 2015 15 and 16 in early 18, if you can follow all that.
Yeah.
So it was a real baptism by fire, to use a cliche, in terms of learning the numbers, learning the business. And you're sitting there, doing a conference. So we did a conference call announcing the first call the company did, again since mid 2014, with the new CFO, reconstituted board, and a lot of strategic activity under the hood that was interesting, compelling, and did this call with investors, and they were pretty ravenous for information. I'd say, and then we went through a process of doing more calls, each one in arrears. So then a few months later, in May, I think it was, we did the 17 numbers and filed the 17 K. And then, being in 18, then we started doing the quarterlies, and we basically were caught up. We got caught up in the second quarter of 2018 and relisted in September. The biggest strategic concern from an IR perspective was the shareholder transition. So unlike an IPO, where stock is coming out, you build a book, and you have a very good sense of where the stock is going, working with an underwriter. In this case, it was more akin to a secondary of sorts that was occurring away from you, because as soon as the stock listed, you in theory could have tens of with 36 million shares out, untold amounts of stock floating out into the market. We did a non-deal roadshow, sort of a deal roadshow. Again, we weren't raising capital, just relisting. We tried to do and build up a lot of momentum in advance of the relisting.
Yep.
Made a big deal out of that, and hit the road for 2 weeks straight, and just did what I've done on secondaries combined with other deals, just to get the interest up. And the stock went up a lot during the non-deal roadshow, which was great. And then we relisted, and we transitioned entirely over time. And to this day, in second half of 2020, there are still at the top of the list a couple of shareholders that were there throughout that whole time that we were on the pink sheets in private. But most of it's turned over. And then last year we joined some indexes, importantly the Russell, and most importantly, or interestingly, the S&P 600, which is a whole different process. There's no visibility into that, and that created a whole nother set of passive buyers for the shares.
And during that process, throughout the kind of first 6 months of your tenure with the company in 2018, was there a moment, or did you get a sense that you were kind of reestablishing credibility? Presumably there must have been, even though you mentioned there was a new board, new CFO, you were new to the company. I would presume at some points you must have encountered some skepticism.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, was there a moment as you were going through that process of sort of, stating kind of, or getting through the kind of backlog of financial reporting and so on, and kind of reestablishing your brand with the street, that you thought, I think this is working. I think this is beginning to take.
Yeah, I would say it was trying to build credibility from scratch, because there was really very little to no credibility. People thought it was a good business, but the reality was the numbers that were out there previously, because the restatement meant that all the previous filings before the relisting were null and void. So it was like, I have to say to people, this 2014 Jumbo K that goes all the way back to 2008 is your Genesis. It's your Bible. Nothing else matters. Nothing else exists. And rebuilding the model with people. There are certainly people who I never talked to, I know, and I'm sure had, probably had a bad experience. I mean, the stock, basically, what you have to know, and I didn't go through the pricing, but anyone watching this should pull up the ticker. ticker used to be HGR. It's now HNGR. But I mean, the stock at the relisting went to $2. It had been at 40. It got cut in half multiple times before it got to $2. And then when we relisted, it was already back in the 20s.
Huh.
So, people saw value there. And part of what most companies couldn't survive what this company went through in terms of being a viable, public company. But because of what the company does and its stature and the critical nature of what we provide, which we've learned a lot more about during COVID, candidly, the demand and the revenue held in there. And it wasn't like vendors were wounded, the company paid its bills, there was no fraud. But there were a lot of questions about the management team. There were a lot of questions about how did this happen, a lot of questions about the auditors, a lot of questions about the board. And, management had to be prepared, unfortunately, and this is something I assessed when I interviewed, are they going to be able to deal with that gauntlet? Because I had questions, anyone who interview for a position like that, when you don't even have current financials, you're sort of inherently taking a bet. So I did my diligence coming in, even as an outsider, and I felt like I understood what was going on. So, but this is the kind of thing where, we all at the end of the day approach our jobs different ways. But you couldn't do this job successfully at this company or be a CFO or the head accountant, chief accounting officer, what have you, lawyer, counsel, unless you really believe in what we do and believe in the people and the mission and really understand it. Yep. So with kind of conviction, it's a lot easier to get there. But we had many periods, and we still do, even now, where people are skeptical. But our short interest has remained relatively low, and most of the resistance we face now is more just around the growth profile of the company, which is somewhat limited because of the end market we serve.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you're a mission-driven organization. You mentioned that, that has particularly come into focus during COVID. From an IR perspective, what are the ways in which COVID has sort of impacted your IR program? Naturally, we're all interacting like this virtually, but, are there other ways in which your IR program has been affected?
Yeah, I really feel like that chapter is being written, as we speak, Ben. Beyond the, tactical issues of doing a lot of video and phone calls, and I'm, as you can tell, working remotely, or should be able to tell I'm working remotely. My office doesn't look quite this snazzy. I wish I had a couch in it at work. But, I feel like the most challenging part is the external part and just being cut off from folks. We have, as a small cap, faced real challenges in getting additional sell side coverage. That already those tea leaves were there with MiFID coming to the States already, and with COVID and just other considerations. It's challenging to be a small cap company, no matter how good you are. Or how sound your mission is, or how profitable and how well run and what a good capital allocator you might be. So the ability to engage the sell side, the ability to have that personal interaction with people has been very challenging. But we've adapted to it. I think it's been a tremendous learning experience for everybody. I think it's remarkable how well internally we work in a remote setting. Our corporate officers are all here in Austin, Texas, where I live. So for earnings and those sorts of things, we do most stuff remote. We just reported last week, but we come together and do our call live together from the company and then go back our separate ways. Sure. But, I'm doing a lot of thinking about, with the lack of sell-side coverage, which is made worse by COVID, as well as the kind of just distant situation, that I think, the amount of proactive work that's going to need to be done to get in front of investors, so-called targeting, is tremendous. And so we're looking at, vendors, myself, other novel ways to reach out and work with folks to get that level of visibility to make sure we're valued, as appropriately as we can, given what we've accomplished and hope to accomplish going forward.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's a challenge that, as you say, many small cap IR professionals are reckoning with at the moment, is the sort of underlying trends pre-COVID and the way that COVID has sort of, in some respects, exacerbated sort of coverage or visibility of small cap stocks. And so we look forward to hearing, in the future, sort of what's worked for you, perhaps what hasn't. And Seth, thanks so much for participating in this video. It's been really interesting to hear your story.
I appreciate the interest and appreciate IR Magazine and everything you guys do for our profession.
Great. Thanks so much.